Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military of Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 30th of April of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. You know that currently we are living in a very interesting situation. Almost every single Western country demands from the Russians to make more. The Russians announced Easter ceasefire, that wasn't enough. The Russians announced May ceasefire, and this is also not enough. Zelensky and Ukraine and the Western countries demand 30-day ceasefire, which the Russians are not able to accept. And this is a very interesting situation because you know that today and these days Zelensky issued ultimatum to the Russian Federation. Even Donald Trump asked Putin to announce and to accept this 30-day ceasefire because if he doesn't accept this, if Russia doesn't accept this, something big and something terrible may happen. For example, today we got details of Trump's 15-minute conversation with Zelensky. Zelensky told Trump in the Vatican that he does not recognize Crimea as a part of Russia. So this is his position. Trump responded very smart that he doesn't care, he doesn't demand this. His plans provides for negotiations of the peninsula as Russian only by the United States. And that's it. So Trump will recognize in the United States. That's it. Trump also insisted that Zelensky sign an agreement between the United States and Ukraine on subsoil resources as soon as possible. In addition, Zelensky said that he is not afraid to make concessions to end the war, but this requires secure guarantees. So we're returning back to the ultimatum. So what is this ultimatum about? These days, President of Ukraine spoke a lot about missile strike during the 9th of May on the parade in Moscow. In his nightly address, Zelensky suggested that Kyiv may target Russia's upcoming Victory Day parade in Moscow, describing it as a strategic pressure point. You know that this is not going to be an attack on Moscow, on Putin, on Russians. This is going to be an attack on Chinese, on Indians, on Hungarians, on Slovakians, on Belarusians. He's going to attack a lot of leaders during this day. He is going to create a very, very dangerous provocation, which will obviously lead to complete collapse of the negotiation process and quit of the United States of America from this process. Furthermore, we have very important statement from the Ukrainian authorities. Ukraine may strike Red Square during the victory parade on May 9th. This was stated by the security of the Verkhovna Rada Committee on National Security, Defense and Intelligence Kostyantynivka. The Kyiv region has the ability to carry out such a strike. Ukraine has long-range weapons for this. So obviously we're talking about very dangerous game. So the question is, how exactly Zelensky's ultimatum sounds like? According to my understanding of the situation, Zelensky issued the following ultimatum. Either you, the Russians, you, Putin, accept this 30-day ceasefire without any precondition today, right now, or we, the Ukrainians, will attack the territory of the Russian Federation, Moscow, the Red Square, with long-range missiles, and we will create a very, very, very dangerous provocation. As for now, we see that the Russians haven't reacted and haven't responded to this provocation because most likely the Russians are trying to understand how exactly the Ukrainians are planning to do this, because obviously the questions of security, the most important question in Moscow during this date, during the 9th of May, when Moscow will be visited by many leaders from all over the world. As for now, the Russians decided to use some pause to understand what Russia can do with this. And Ukrainians understand that if the Russians will reject this ultimatum, they will be forced to attack. Otherwise, nobody will trust and believe them in the future. And their words will cost nothing. So this is the main problem for Zelensky, because he has already announced that he's going to do something. And now if he changes his mind, then nobody will believe him in the future. Now he is forced to, by himself, to follow what he said. And Ukrainians understand, if they attack Russia with long-range missiles, and if they are able to break through the Russian air defense and to deal some damage during this holiday, this is going to be something more than just the special military operation. And very interesting situation that these days we start receiving lots of very important updates regarding Ukrainian mobilization. For example, today we got report that Contract 60 Plus Rada is preparing to send all people to war. Ukrainian deputies are preparing a bill allowing the conclusion of a military contract with Ukrainians over 60 years old. Also, the Ukrainian Minister of Health is preparing lists of doctors to remove the reservation from mobilization. A corresponding request was received from the Ministry of Defense and the Armed Forces of Ukraine. So these two statements are very important. And I'll remind you that yesterday we got another very important article from Ukraine. According to information, we discussed the situation yesterday that General Staff required and mobilization of recruiters. This applies to those who did not fight and have no health restrictions. We discussed that currently the recruiting army of Ukraine is more than 110,000 soldiers. And more or less, and we saw videos, that we saw videos when those recruiters were capturing and kidnapping people all over the entire Ukraine. And I can tell one thing for sure, that obviously they have no health restrictions according to the bodies and according how many kilometers they are able to run after their target or something like this. No health restrictions, obviously. So we believe that according to this pipeline of mobilization about recruiters, according to another pipeline of mobilization, Contract 60 Plus, according to another pipeline of mobilization to remove doctors from reservation, and according to the fourth pipeline, we're talking about Contract 18 Plus, we believe that during the next 2 months, the Ukrainians in Ukraine is able to mobilize up to 200,000 people. That's a lot. That's obviously lots, a very huge army that can be sent to the line of combat contact, that can be equipped, well trained, and with the purpose to either attack deep inside territory of Russia or to repel possible Russian attacks, Russian offensives, Russian counterattacks after May's provocation that most likely is going to happen. So the situation is very difficult, is very critical, and this is the reason why the Western countries are asking Russia to accept this 60-day ceasefire, 30-day ceasefire, because they understand that most likely they will not be able to force Zelensky not to do this. Putin is easier to deal with than Zelensky. He has no cards and he asks for more and more. So probably Trump tried to force Zelensky, tried to ask Zelensky not to attack Russia during the 9th of May and during the May's holidays, but most likely he got just rejection and refusal. And he believes that maybe Putin will accept this because Putin is easier to deal with than Zelensky. The situation is very difficult, and this is the reason why every single media in the world is saying that the next days are very important, because if Russia doesn't accept and reject Ukrainian Zelensky's ultimatum, then another spiral, another wave of escalation is ahead of us. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground. We have lots of very important updates, so let's start. And first we are going to talk about the Lyman direction. This is the southern Kupyansk area. We started discussion of the situation on the ground in this area during the previous video, and during the previous 12 hours, basically during the 30th of April of 2025, we got a lot of very important updates. The Russians managed to improve their position significantly. Let's discuss in details. Today, pro-Russian resources published this video where we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking with all type of calibers. They have bases, temporary deployment points of the armed forces of Ukraine in the southern Kupyansk or the Lyman direction. The Russians were focused to destroy as many as possible temporary deployment points and to ruin Ukrainian logistic, and the most important, to ruin Ukrainian reserves that can be sent to the line of combat contact. And most likely all these attacks brought significant results for the Russians, because according to information we have, as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Nova and over the settlement by the name of Lipova. So let's take a look at how the map was changing. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 29th of April. We got reports that the Russians, as you can see, managed to outflank the settlement of Nova and to reach the outskirts of Lipova, and the Russians managed to get and to cut the settlement of Nova and cut settlement of Ritkadub, so Ukrainians lost any supply and support in this settlement. And today, by the end of the 30th of April, we got a very different picture. The Russians managed to establish complete control over this territory. Once again, this information was confirmed by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. According to them, the group of forces West managed to do this, and later, probably a few hours later, the Russians published also this video, where we can see a lot of episodes of clashes on the territory of the settlement carried out by the 144th Division of the Russian Federation. Here we can see lots of episodes how the Russians were attacking, FPV droning, capturing Ukrainians, bombing Ukrainian positions, artillery positions, mortar positions, how the Russians were storming Ukrainian trenches and strongholds, how the Russians were destroying Ukrainian drones, how the Russians were capturing prisoners of war, and the most important, how the Russians were raising their flags above the territory of the settlement of Nova. In this video, exactly in this moment, we can see two Russian soldiers that did this in the central part, and later we got another episode from another part of the settlement. And during the previous 24 hours, we also got another video where the Russians raised their flag in the most western part of the settlement of Lipova. So during the previous 24 hours, the Russian soldiers were spotted in this point, the Russian flags were discovered in this area and were geolocated in this point, which means that indeed, as a result of offensive operation, as a result of active actions of the group of forces West, the Russians managed to establish complete control over this territory, and this is obviously significant progress from the Russian side. Furthermore, several pro-Russian resources have already reported that as a result of offensive operation, the armored force of the Russian Federation entered the settlement of Zelena Dolina. Currently, there are very heavy clashes for this settlement, and the Russians are planning to continue. Now we understand that after the fall of the village of Nova and Lipova, the Russians will attack the settlement of Ritkadub in full strength. Furthermore, for example, by the end of the 30th of April, we start receiving first reports that the Russians managed to answer the eastern part of the settlement, and currently the Ukrainians are trying to slow down the Russians and to stabilize the situation, but according to sources from the ground, the Ukrainians can't do this. Anyway, we see that during the next several days, and very likely probably even before the 9th of May, the Russians will be able to establish complete control over the territory like this. And this is going to be the beginning, already the beginning of the battle for the city of Lyman. Because from this direction, the Russians will split their group of offensive in two parts. The first group of forces will continue advancing further from the settlement of Ritkadub towards the village of by the name of Karpovka and the river of Nitrius. And when the Russians, as soon as the Russians reach the river and reach this settlement, they will continue advancing further in the southern direction along the river of Nitrius until they get the settlement of Shandrigalova. At the same time, the Russians will continue offensive operation from the settlement of Zelena Dolina in the direction of Shandrigalova as well, but this time from the northeast. Also, the Russians will continue their offensive operation in the direction of the settlements of Kolodizy and Stavki from the north. But as for this offensive, most likely another group of Russian forces will be involved in this operation. We're talking about those Russians that are in the vicinity of Tarskoye. After the fall of Shandrigalova, the Russians will continue moving further in the direction of Drobysheva. So we expect that during May, the Russians will be able to reach the settlement of Drobysheva. The Russians will take under control the settlement of Stavki, and most likely the Russians will finish the battle for the settlement of Zarishne, where we believe that this is going to happen between May and June, more precisely, of 2025. And this is exactly the same thing that we saw in 2022 when the Russians just began their special military operation, because they were attacking the city of Lyman using the same tactics. They were moving along the river of Nitrius. The Russians established, first of all, control over these three villages, and only then the Russians began assault operation in the direction of the city of Lyman. The same thing we saw from Ukrainian side during the late 2022 during their Kharkiv counter-offensive operation. And as soon as the Russians are able to take under control these three villages, we expect that the Russians will attack the city of Lyman from the south east, this is exactly what the Russians did in 2022. We believe that the Russians are not going to change their tactics. They're going to do the same. And if the Russians are able to do everything we just discussed, Ukrainians most likely will begin withdrawing their positions in the direction of the city of Slavyansk. Of course, Ukrainian army of 2025 is completely different thing in comparison with Ukrainian army of 2022. But and of course, the Russians will spend much more time in comparison with 2022. But obviously, this is something that the Russians are planning to carry out. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Siversk direction, where according to different pro-Russian resources, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to shorten the distance to the city of Siversk itself. This information today was confirmed by different pro-Russian mappers, and according to them, the Russians by the end of the 30th of April of 2025 established control over these territories. Obviously, this is very important progress, because now we see that the Russians managed to cut these, let's say, these 4 settlements in 4 different defense lines. We're talking about the settlement of Grigorovka, the settlement of Serebryanka, the city of Siversk, and the settlement of Verkhnykamensk. And we expect that if this information with Russian advance deep inside of the territory of Ukraine, deep inside of this, let's say, foothold and bridgehead is correct, we believe that now the Russians will begin offensive operation in the direction of the western part of the city of the village of Verkhnykamensk. And this can lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense, and this can lead probably even this upcoming night that Ukrainians would be forced to fall back first in the direction of Novosilka and then in the direction of the city of Siversk. So the lines in the Siversk direction can collapse very quick and very fast and very soon. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kostyantynivka direction. During the previous 24 hours, we received lots of important updates. As for the city of Chasiv Yar itself, nothing special and nothing changed since the previous video. The Russians are about to finish their offensive operation in the central part on the territory of the citadel. The Russians continue improving their positions around the settlement of Stupachki, trying to take under complete control this small village, and the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction in the central part, trying to take under complete control the micro district of Shevchenka. So nothing special. The most important updates today are coming from the Torets-Konstantinovka direction. According to information we have, the Russians managed to establish complete control, not complete, but the most important control over the most important part of this mine. I'll remind you that the Russians several weeks ago managed to carry out very successful breakthrough operation, and as a result of that offensive, they established complete control over the settlement of Nilipovka, and the Russians ruined Ukrainian defense lines. That was very interesting offensive. The Ukrainians made lots of attempts to counterattack the Russians, but all those attacks were repelled. And during the previous 2 weeks, the Russians, or 3 weeks, the Russians were completely focused in their offensive operation in the direction of this mine. There were very heavy clashes. We were adjusting maps slowly, step by step. And today we got final video which confirms at least control over the most important parts of this stronghold. In this video, we can see lots of FPV drone attacks from the Ukrainian side, and there are lots of episodes how Ukrainians were attacking the Russian flags on the territory of this mine. So this is not this video. Let's take a look. It's the wrong video. We will adjust the video in the near future, and if you have access to map, you will be able to see. So in this video, you could see how Ukrainians were attacking positions of the Russian forces, their flags. There were 2 flags raised on the territory of this mine, and that Ukrainians were trying to destroy them. So 2 flags were established on the biggest construction on the territory of this mine. So we have proofs that the Russians control at least 50% of this territory. Now let's move further. As for the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians continue their offensive operation, and today we got a very important video from the settlement of Nova Poltava. In this video we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking positions of the armored forces of Ukraine in the southern and in the central parts of the settlement. Very heavy explosions, as you can see. We can see these water reservoirs in this area that the Russians are planning to use as the natural barriers for their positions, and we see that the Russians are about to begin offensive operation from the settlement of Berezovka in the northern direction, and this might happen every single moment. As for the southern Pokrovsk direction, during the previous 24 hours, as you can see, we have additional changes on the ground. The Russians managed to improve their positions along the railways in the direction of the settlement by the name of Novoukrainka. In this video, we can see how the Russians were moving along the railways under very heavy Ukrainian artillery fire. The Russians were attacking from their side. They were preparing the foothold and the railways for Russian offensive. So we see that currently there are very heavy clashes, but due to the changes on the ground, the Russians are advancing and they're improving their positions. As for the southwestern flank of the city of Pokrovsk, the Russians continue their offensive operation, and today we got several reports that the Russians secured the settlement of Uspenovka completely, and that the Russians improved their positions in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Kotlarovka, and that the Russians began offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Troitskaya. I'll remind you that there are just 3 villages left before the Russians are able to answer the Dnipro region, and according to my understanding of the situation, most likely the Russians will try to do this before the beginning of May holidays, and they will announce this as a huge Russian media victory. As for the South Donetsk direction, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Bogatyr. This village is under very heavy fire, but despite all Russian attempts to answer the settlement, they still haven't managed to dig in deeper. The Ukrainians control the situation around the settlement. It is very difficult to understand. The Russians are bombing and attacking the settlement with all calibers they have, but despite all this pressure, the Ukrainians hold their lines. The Russians are advancing, and according to updates we have, the Russians improve their position to the south of this company's stronghold. Several tree lines and fields were taken. As for the area between the let's say South Donetsk direction and the Zaporozhye direction, we haven't received anything special. The Russians published lots of videos how they were bombing and attacking the settlement of Gulyai Polye. Here we can see how another temporary deployment point or some positions of the armored forces of Ukraine were destroyed as a result of FAB attack. Another video of airstrike took place in the city of Kamenskaya. I'll remind you that in March and February this area was very active, but now we don't see any changes on the ground. Most likely the Ukrainians managed to stabilize the situation, and we continue receiving lots of videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking the city of Kherson. I'll remind you that several days ago we got report that the Russians crossed the river of Dnipro and that the Russians established some control of the area around the settlement of Tyaginka, but we still haven't received anything that can confirm this. But we continue receiving lots of videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking the city of Kherson, and how the Russians were bombing different positions of the armored forces of Ukraine along the river of Dnipro. Maybe the Russians have some plans to do this, but as for now they are limiting themselves with different strikes, and that's it. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.